Hi guys, and welcome to Chapter 8. Chapter 8 is on biodiversity as well as conservation biology. For the first lecture of Chapter 8, we will be going over an introduction to what biodiversity is. Now, biodiversity can be broadly defined as the variety of life across all levels of biological organization. Now, this occurs at different spatial and different organizational scales. Now, at the broadest scale, ecosystem diversity is biodiversity at the landscape scale. Now, this is reference to the number as well as the variety of ecosystems within a given landscape. Now, this may include a diversity of habitats, a diversity of communities, or a diversity of ecosystems at the landscape level. And this can also refer to differences in the size, shapes, and connections among different patches within an ecosystem within a given landscape. Now, examples of ecosystem diversity within a landscape could be the presence of beaches, cliffs, coral reefs, as well as ocean waters within a coastal landscape. So the number of features as well as the number of ecosystem or habitat types within a landscape contributes to its ecosystem diversity. All else equal, an area with a variety of vegetation would hold more biodiversity than the same area with only one plant type. Now, the next form of biodiversity, scaled down a little bit at a higher resolution, is what is called species diversity. And species diversity essentially means the number and variety of species within a given ecosystem. Now, speciation is when a species splits into two different species, which increases species diversity. Recall that we go over this in depth in Chapter 3's conversation about evolution. However, the process of extinction, when a species is completely wiped off the globe, will also decrease diversity. Now, species diversity is dependent on two very important and very different factors. The first is something called species richness. Species richness is broadly defined as the number of species in a given ecosystem. Simply put, the more species you have in a given area, the higher your species richness metric. And this essentially means that a given area is going to be more biologically diverse. The second key factor in determining species diversity is something called evenness. And you can think of this as the balance of species within a given ecosystem. Evenness is defined as the degree to which species in a given area are evenly distributed. Now, while species richness can be a sort of simple topic, it's pretty easy to determine or to understand that more species in a given ecosystem means a more biologically diverse ecosystem. Species evenness can be a little bit more conceptually difficult to process. So let's go through it with a small example. For example, imagine that we have two different habitats with two different communities. Each community has 4 different species in it, so each community has a species richness value of 4, and each community has 20 individuals in it. However, Community 1 has 5 individuals in it for each species present, meaning that species A has 5 individuals, species B has 5 individuals, species C has 5 individuals, as well as species D. So this community, Community 1, is going to be fairly well balanced and has a very high evenness metric. However, contrast that with Community 2. While Community 2 still has the same number of species, it still has 4 species, and therefore has the same richness value as Community 1. In Community 2, 16 of the 20 individuals come from species A, but only 1 individual comes from species B, C, and D. So therefore, even though they have the same richness value and the same number of individuals, Community 1 has a far greater evenness metric compared to Community 2. And this is because within Community 1, the species numbers are far more evenly distributed. Therefore, Community 1 is far more diverse. So next, we increase our resolution even farther to look at diversity within a given species. And this refers to something called genetic diversity. Genetic diversity is the variety of genes in the DNA pool of a species population in a given area. Now, genetic diversity is incredibly important because higher genetic diversity is very strongly related to the long-term survival of a species. Basically, if you have high genetic diversity within a species population, you have a better chance that a few individuals in any given species within a population will have some sort of genes to cope with any given environmental change. Now, contrast that with populations with low genetic diversity. Populations with low genetic diversity are more vulnerable to environmental change or to something like disease. And this is because if you have low genetic diversity within a population, there is less of a chance that a few individuals in a given species will have the genes to cope with any given environmental change. So when you have high genetic diversity, you have a high chance of species that have the adaptations which can cope with the pressures of natural selection. If you don't have high genetic diversity, you have a far less chance that any given individual from a species will have the adaptations to cope with environmental change, and as a result, you have a less chance that that species will be able to survive and persist to reproduce in the future. So, when you have low genetic diversity, you often find that low genetic diversity populations fall into something called inbreeding depression. And inbreeding depression refers to the tendency for small populations to inbreed, meaning that related parents have offspring, and this reduces genetic diversity to a very low level and increases the chances not only of not being able to have successful adaptations to survive and to reproduce into the future, but also increasing the chance of having rare genetic birth defects. So low genetic diversity can be very detrimental to the long-term survival rate of any population of a given species. Now, biodiversity is not evenly distributed or evenly spread across the globe. Species diversity tends to be greatest near the equator. Basically, equatorial ecosystems, those ecosystems that are right around the center of the Earth, are going to be very hot and very wet. And typically, all else equal, hotter and wetter ecosystems usually are going to have the highest diversity in species. Now, in addition to this, species diversity typically declines as you move from the equator to the polar regions of the globe. And this is because the polar regions tend to be much harsher environments, much drier and much colder than the regions of the equatorial. Now, within biodiversity, there are a few more additional trends. For example, the smaller in size physically that a species is, the greater the chances of high diversity. For example, insects alone overwhelmingly contain the largest number of species within any given taxon on the planet. Beetles, 40% of the insect class, alone outnumber all non-insect species and all other plant species combined. So insects have a staggeringly high amount of biodiversity. Now, that is all that we have for you today. I hope you enjoyed this brief introduction into what biodiversity is and how it contributes to stability around the planet. Tomorrow, we're going to go over some of the benefits of biodiversity, basically why we should keep it around and how it pertains to us. Until then, I'll see you tomorrow. Take care.